A large seafaring vessel rests atop a vast, dark ocean. Through the abstracted view of the radar, we can see 10 tiny dots slowly making their way down the screen, the perspective jumping lower to make the titular abyss look all the more enormous and imposing. One dot begins moving quickly, then flashing red, then it's gone. With no other indication, we can tell that something happened. And then it happens again, and again, and again, and again, until there's only one ship remaining, left to brave the darkness alone. And that's you. This is the opening to the recently released Death in Abyss, and I'd say it is extremely effective in conveying the overall horror theming of the game. Despite being a big fan of horror games, though, I find myself much more interested in the mechanical premise. I can't claim to be too knowledgeable in the genre, but I don't know of many other shooters that have this unlimited movement in 3 axes. There are some that play with depth or verticality, but all the ones that come to mind are either on a rail or affected by gravity. But in this game, along with the ability to move forward, backward, left, and right relative to the camera, which can be moved with a mouse to tilt the ship horizontally or vertically, there are dedicated buttons for ascending and descending the ship. You can basically move to any point in the sphere-shaped level that you so desire. Perhaps that is why the game takes place in water instead of in the air, as it's easier to relate the experience of considering verticality to something widely understood, like underwater swimming. Just as well, a combination of pop culture and scientific literacy has imbued the public with the knowledge of just how terrifying even the wildlife is when you go deep enough below sea level. The average enemies in this game are either relentlessly fast and aggressive, gigantic in size, powerful enough to deal significant damage to the player, or any combination of the three, with some enemy types presenting their own unique form of challenge. The mechanics and the framing do well to support each other here. The player is able to understand the danger enemies pose relative to how terrifying they are, and the enemies evoke anxiety from the fact that failing to effectively deal with them is extremely punishing. I use the word punishing very carefully here, because the word difficult might be unclear. We can break the definition of difficulty into 2 categories: how hard it is to avoid failure, and what happens when failure occurs. Let's call these 2 categories execution and punishment. And as I've just said, punishment feels like the primary way that Death in Abyss creates difficulty. Your ship's health can drain quickly, and can only be restored a little bit by engaging in combat, and dying resets your progress to the beginning of the level. Each level is typically at least a couple minutes, making the punishment relatively substantial to total playtime. The focus on punishment as difficulty becomes even more obvious later on as the game begins to put more and more emphasis on instantly killing the player. I'll have more to say about that later on, but let's go back to the subject of execution. Within the concept of difficulty derived from execution, we can again break that down into 2 more categories: precision and variability. Hopefully precision is generally self-explanatory. The less time and less leeway you have to perform a certain maneuver, the more difficult it will be, due to the imprecision of the human body. I guess you could extend concepts of physical strain to the category, but that would probably apply more to sports than computer games. Variability is a somewhat broad designation. The most obvious example to reach for would be random number generation, but even effectively deterministic games can have variability if some factors are based on player input. Again, due to the imprecision of the human body, the state of the game can be drastically different with just a second of divergent input. This variability will either test the player on their reaction time or on application of proactive strategy. The reason I bring this up is to establish a definition of the form that Death in Abyss takes. I may be overgeneralizing, but I don't think aiming is much of a challenge in this game. To speak on my own ability, I would say that I'm probably not very good at aiming with a mouse under any sort of speed or pressure. However, none of the challenges cause me to struggle specifically because of my mediocre aim. This could be in part due to crutches like the homing missile attack, the shotgun blast, the shockingly generous hitboxes, and the often large targets. Regardless, I'd say the main challenge in the game is based on the movement of the ship and the positioning relative to enemies. In a way, it's vaguely similar to a traditional shoot-'em-up, where the gameplay is chiefly defined by movement and positioning. The aiming and shooting in these types of games is contained within the element of positioning, and obviously most of the difficulty and complexity in design comes from the movement and interface with obstacles. There's a very specific comparison I want to draw with this footage of Toho 7, which is a fairly popular shoot-'em-up if you weren't aware. Let's pause on this frame and count the number of options I have in terms of inputs. Now, if we exclude shooting or using a bomb, then I can go in 8 different directions. We can technically double my actions if we count moving slowly in focus. Moving up might seem like a bad choice for this attack, but if you're close enough to the boss, you don't need to deal with the somewhat complicated pattern cluttering most of the screen. It's difficult to dodge her point-blank attack, but it can be a lot less mentally overwhelming. Managing your vertical position in a level is one of the most important things to do in general in a game like this, of course. Now, here's a frame from the second level of Death in Abyss. As you can tell by the indicator, I'm about to get hit. Now obviously, I have even more options on paper. Not only do I have 6 different buttons for movement, but just by sliding my mouse I can effectively increase my options to be dozens of thousands of times more complicated. However, to react to this attack, there's only one option. The dodge is the most centralizing mechanic of Death and Abyss. Moving without the boost is incredibly slow. Even if you could get close enough to faraway enemies to consistently chase them, the default movement speed would leave you wide open to every enemy in the game. There are some attacks, such as the Queen's Laser, which are programmatically impossible to avoid unless you time a dodge, and any commitment to movement that the dodge creates can quickly be undone by simply dodging in the opposite direction. There's really no advantage that can be granted from the default movement, and you can use the dodge boost at any time. The only downside is that it has a meter that will damage the ship if you dodge and boost too much too quickly. Which is to say, the most important skill when it comes to mastering the game is merely finding the proper rhythm to dodge as often as possible without ticking up the meter. You might assume, at the very least with the dodge mechanic taking up the brunt of how to move, that the game could allow its complexity to be put into where to move. However, one look at the average enemies will show you the second and third most important skills to learn in this game. The two most common enemy types are the Scavenger, who chases after the player, and the Stalker, who chases around the player with an attack where they shoot their tongue out very quickly. This move requires a bit more attention and movement if you're in an awkward position. Alternatively, you could just not get too close in the first place, which is much more effective. The arena is incredibly large and technically limited in a spherical shape, but the player is warned when they're out of bounds and given the opportunity to return to the center. The optimal strategy to avoid damage from most enemies, then, is to move in a vaguely elliptical pattern around the level. The only thing to stymie this otherwise infallible strategy of rhythmically dodge and move in a circle is the presence of higher priority targets, which will encourage the player to either move forward towards them to take them out faster, or move backwards away from them to avoid taking damage. The tumors serve as a good target to make progress when nothing much else is going on due to them being inanimate. The splash damage they deal when destroyed makes them even better when other enemies are in pursuit. The Metabug inhabits a similar tier, and that it's nice to have the temporary power-up they grant, but typically only worth targeting when there's nothing scary to deal with. The Crab is an interesting foe in that it's easy to deal with, but making the entire level dark and quiet aside from its eyes piercing the void is really fucking cool. It scared the hell out of me the first few times I played, and to an extent the panic of dealing with it can increase the pressure, but this enemy more than anything exposes the fact that the basic act of enemy avoidance is so simple, you could literally do it with your eyes closed. The aforementioned Queen poses an interesting disruption by shooting a laser beam from across the stage, which you must dodge based on the visual indicator. It directly addresses the optimal strategy of maintaining a rhythm with the dodge by forcing you onto a different rhythm, even if only for one or two attacks. The one problem is that on the 4th level you gain access to a power-up that works even in the previous levels, the Infused Organ. Dodging into certain attacks will reset the boost meter, which actually makes this enemy beneficial to the player, and that allows them to dodge more frequently. Dodging the laser with this power-up will also deal counter damage, which means you barely even need to give the Queen any attention from then on. The problem will deal with itself and help you out along the way, freeing you to focus on a target more worth your time. The Parasite enemy, which has a dedicated introductory intermission between the first and second level, offers the potential of a new skill to develop by forcing the player to use the rear view to shoot at it once it latches on. During an encounter with other foes, this would mean the player has to avoid danger while looking backwards. However, the player can simply avoid this challenge by killing the parasite before it latches on. This is generally no harder than targeting any other enemy, but becomes trivial when they start to chase you, because you can employ the simple strategy of moving backwards while using the shotgun blast. You can also deal damage to the parasite when it's attached by boosting, which the player will constantly be doing all the time no matter what. The parasite is actually interesting in that it gets replaced by the Parasite 2 in layer levels. The other tiered enemies are usually just more difficult variations upon each other, but the Parasite 2 is hugely different in behavior. While it does hang in the periphery of the action most of the time, it attacks not by lunging in, but by shooting a ball of energy that slowly tracks the player. This ball of energy often blends in with the crowd of scavengers and stalkers, but with the infused organ it can be dispelled if the player dodges into it. The final common enemy type, the Shark, is perhaps the most dangerous in that it can reset your progress by destroying tumors, and its bite can instantly kill the player. However, its behavior is quite similar to the original Parasite in that it just sort of lunges at you and can be easily dealt with by moving backwards while targeting it. It may seem like oversimplification to boil every enemy down to the act of rhythmically dodging in a vaguely circular pattern either towards or away from them, but outside of the technically optional Stalker 2 variant, none of them have a complicated movement pattern that requires addressing them in a different way. There isn't an enemy that required me to use the vertical movement buttons to deal with them consistently, and as a result, most of the nuance of the movement system is held within the dodge and boost. But the game only has one trick to challenge rhythmic dodging, a test of timing that only becomes easier a third of the way into the game. Now, if you want to see a game with much more nuance in its movement system, we don't need to look far. One of the major inspirations for Death and Abyss, listed right on the store page, is Devil Daggers, a fast-paced shooter set in a simple level where the player is meant to see how long they can last against a constant wave of enemies. Devil Daggers has a bunny hop mechanic where the player has to rhythmically press jump upon landing to give themselves a burst of speed. I believe that Death and Abyss is trying to emulate exactly this mechanic, or rather the action of rhythmically tapping for speed and survival, but it lacks the depth on display. The default movement in Devil Daggers is fast enough to outrun most enemies, and the bunny hop has extreme momentum, meaning you'll have to slow down and use the default movement if you want more control. The reason you want more control is because the game takes place in a very small arena, where you die instantly if you fall off the side. So the two modes of movement are more than just a matter of timing a button press. You have to balance speed and control to both avoid enemies and manage your position in the level. Because dodging in Death and Abyss gives both speed and control, there's no decision making, you just maintain a rhythm, which is only one part of the challenge of bunny hopping in Devil Daggers. Decision making in general is an area where I'd say Death and Abyss comes up lacking. The weapon upgrade mechanic in Devil Daggers will force the player to stop shooting to keep up with the increasing difficulty. It may even encourage the player to not just focus higher priority targets, but to keep alive some weaker foes as a method of farming gems early, introducing long-term resource management for higher level play. Basically every action in Devil Daggers will have an effect on the rest of the run, forcing the player to think proactively. Death and Abyss, though, is largely reactive. You dodge lasers within a timing window and focus higher priority targets when they appear. Your efficiency with this can depend on how well you've memorized the timing of certain events, but for the most part the player is reacting to what happens in the moment rather than planning into the future. There are mild exceptions to this, of course. A significant chunk of the levels play with some gimmick that will either undo progress or instantly kill the player. However, even the most brutal of instant kill attacks don't require any more than a few seconds of anticipation in order to deal with. The player won't always be in a situation where they can react to a telegraph, but the difference in preparation is a relatively trivial matter. Just as well, most level gimmicks operate on a cycle. To whatever extent there is proactive planning, it's a matter of scheduled restriction rather than having to improvise your next 30 seconds. Once you've avoided losing, you can simply go back to the pattern of rhythmically dodging enemies while orbiting level. I suppose you could defend the game by saying that, preferences aside, a lack of depth or execution-based difficulty isn't necessarily bad, especially when you consider that the game provides punishment and horror. It certainly has its own appeal. But I would say the game does create challenges where failure is much more likely to occur, all within the score system. Or maybe it's more accurate to call it a grade system, considering you don't have points but rather a binary pass-fail with two criteria: how fast you complete a level, and if you take even a single hit of damage during it. The logic here is almost too obvious. You want to play safely enough to avoid damage, but completing the level quickly will expose you to greater danger. We will ignore the fact that the game records these two checks independently, meaning you can get the highest grade on the level select without doing both in one run, as I think that might be unintentional. Obvious though it may be, an intuitive solution that's easy to implement may not always be the best answer. Death and Abyss has a unique health bar and plenty of systems to restore player health, with even bosses having destructible body parts to allow the player to rally back during combat. All of this is thrown in the fucking trash because now the player needs to restart whenever they get hit a single time. And when the game takes away even the smallest bit of leeway for failure, it lays bare the elements which are either highly variable or flat out random. From my observations, it appears that the height and location of tumors at the start of the level is semi-random with some constraints. Enemy spawn locations are also random, though I assume either constrained by distance from the player or for the larger enemy's proximity to the map border. I believe there's also a bit of variability on what enemies spawn and when. If I had to guess, it would appear that the game does a check on various factors on some interval and then decides whether or not to spawn a certain enemy. For example, on the second level, the Queen does a check on how much progress you made through the level, then it waits a few seconds, then it picks a spot some distance from the player, then it spawns in. And then there's a timer that says don't spawn another Queen until however many seconds, to ensure the player isn't fighting two of them at the same time. And then, on a level where the Queen can spawn from the beginning, it runs this check immediately and will always spawn in around the same time, 10 or so seconds in. It's probably something like that. Sometimes the effect this has on the game is minor. Maybe two tumors will spawn so close to one another that exploding one will explode the other, which might be mildly unoptimal. But the stalker enemy's attack has only a short sound effect as telegraph, so you can easily find yourself in a situation where you're dealing with enemies in front of you and then a stalker spawns behind you, beginning its attack before you can even see it. The telegraph is just long enough that you can feasibly react with an input, but actually reliably dodging is a much more complex matter. You have to dodge in the correct direction with timing variable to how far it is away from you, which you can't really tell if you can't see it. The only option is to immediately dodge forward and hope it works. A better proactive play is to generally be moving forward in order to put yourself further away from spawns behind you and, again, in a generally elliptical movement to survey your surroundings. However, when shooting at a horde of enemies in pursuit, or when dealing with even a single parasite or shark, the player will inevitably move backwards, which will, at least momentarily, put you in a position to be snuck up on by something. The attack of the Parasite 2 can fulfill both sides of this, with the energy ball tracking the player probably alongside other enemies, but also able to sneak up on them due to lacking any audio cue. I think a lack of audio telegraphing for the Stalker and the energy ball is a fairly big issue. In Devil Daggers, for example, the more dangerous enemies have audio cues to indicate to the player that they need to focus on them, something that this game really should have taken from. But this comes at the risk that the commonality of Stalkers will overpower more important sounds, or that Stalkers in front of the player might make the player not realize that there's a Stalker behind them. It's a difficult situation, but it's one that probably would bother me a lot less if the game was set up in a way that would allow me to take one surprise hit without ruining my prime. I hesitate to use the words fair or unfair in the context of a single-player game, because the player can always win if they put in enough time. But when difficulty is largely derived from variability, player skill can only do so much. You have to get at least a little bit lucky, and it's a matter of personal preference whether or not fortune feels good in a game like Death and Abyss. But in the first place, the game didn't need to be this way. If Death and Abyss had a score system where you earn points for killing enemies, with more points for stronger foes, then you could, for example, have a points multiplier that goes down if you get hit, or if you go too long without killing a new enemy. The former would encourage the player not to get hit without essentially eliminating the health bar as a mechanic, and the latter would incentivize the player not to partake in passive strategies of running away for the entire level. You could also give the player points for how much health they have at the end of the level, or a pool of points that drains over time to reward a player for finishing a level quickly. You could have both of these systems at the same time. There are many methods to reward a balance of defense and offense from the player, but the current method just exposes moments of frustration. I've been quite critical for the past 10 pages of my script, so I'll now focus on what I consider the strongest part of the game, the boss fights. The first and second levels are a bit odd in how similar they are, seeing as every level from this point on will either feature a boss fight, a change in scenery, or some unique gimmick that threatens loss of progress or instant death. That the second level just introduces a few new enemies makes it the odd one out of levels 3 through 9, and honestly if this pattern continued for any longer it would probably become boring pretty quickly. That's why I think the first boss came at the perfect time, and the third level was probably the best place for the demo to end on. In terms of delivering on horror, it's hard to deny the effectiveness of looking around to see this monster, much more massive than any other you've fought up to this point, casually floating along, not too close that it obviously just spawned within your proximity, but not too far that you can simply think it emerged from the distant darkness, where most enemies up to this point have either blended in with the horde or appeared right on the edge of the draw distance. This is the first to evoke a particular menace just by entering the area. The eye laser attack and the swarming bloodworm resemble what you previously dealt with from Queens and Scavengers, though with slightly different directions. Which means the most interesting new feature of the Wanderer is the tail, which it swings around wildly after you've shot off an eyeball. There is something finicky about this, particularly when it stops attacking and leaves its tail in a resting position, as the method for avoiding it is difficult to discern. I typically just try going forward towards its head. The more damage you deal, the more variations it has upon the tail attack, and the more frequently it will shoot lasers. Despite whatever frustrations you might feel, the little escalations in the complexity of attack patterns work well to increase tension as the fight goes on. On your first playthrough, the final phase will probably catch you off guard, filling you with both the fear of being inches away from danger for a prolonged period of time and the dread of seeing a completely new attack pattern after having struggled to get to this point in the first place. However, the secret is that the section is actually completely trivial. Just keep moving backwards with reasonable fuel management and you'll never be hit. Even if you never learn just how lenient the hitboxes are, playing through this more than once will show that you're basically in the clear at this point. And honestly, when you're going up against this boss on a replay, having a moment like this almost feels like a reward for surviving the most intense parts of the fight. You did it, so now get into a groove and just keep shooting the damn thing. Right after that, a gigantic centipede appears to deal the player a forced loss, which is what the demo ends on. The fourth level is a scene change caused by this thing dragging you all the way down. This guy's actually in the banner, if you didn't realize. So this thing coming back for a full boss fight near the end almost feels like the fulfillment of a long overdue battle with a rival. Despite the boss drawing clear inspiration from a certain Devil Daggers enemy, you actually fight it mostly by damaging its head. The red weak points are actually just an abundant, though limited method to restore player health. I find the movement of this boss very interesting. I imagine it probably operates on logic not too dissimilar from the Stalker enemies, but the long segmented body makes it feel uniquely snake-like. When it lunges towards the player, it may overshoot and then curve right back around, a move that's very difficult to dodge. Parts of the body can end up protecting the head simply from the boss coiling into a spiral. In that way, there's actually a decent amount of nuance to the optimal relative position the player should have. But then it also just shoots out a bunch of energy blasts randomly as it goes along. It would be pretty easy without this, to be fair, but it also just adds a lot of random bullshit and doesn't feel too in line with the rest of what makes the boss interesting. I guess the point is to make the player change their elevation. Basically every boss has some big, wide, horizontally oriented attack that's very difficult to dodge just by moving the mouse and dodging forward. There is a level of dexterity and muscle memory required to quickly move your finger from D to E, but I don't think it's the most depthful skill to talk about. Now, I'm sure this boss could have accomplished that by swinging its body around, which would have made a lot more sense than random energy energy blast barrage. However, the previous boss already did that, so I understand not wanting to repeat an old trick. Unfortunately, the centipede isn't quite as interesting as either the first or the final boss. Full spoilers ahead, by the way. Again, despite all I've said about the gameplay, there is an appeal to this game which I've hopefully conveyed with my general summary at the beginning of the video. The game is light on narrative, which is pretty fun for a game aiming to be scary, but the premise is essentially that the fleet of ships are sent down to stop some immense threat, and in level 4 the source is identified as this giant egg. The evolution of the egg contextualizes every level gimmick from here on out. First, the egg starts walking around and undoing your progress, then it hatches and shoots a giant laser, then it eats the centipede's corpse and starts exploding the entire level. Finally, from the egg emerges, shivering and pulsating, a moth-like humanoid creature the game calls Mother. To some extent, I'm sure Mother is a pun, because she looks like a moth lady, but there's also a much more literal explanation for the name. I think Mother is probably the highlight of the game, in large part from the massive contrast. From the mechanical ship and robotic text to all the monsters appearing like some cross between insectoid and sea life, Mother really stands out in more ways than one. Seeing her give birth and then fight the player is clear visual storytelling to indicate a goal of protecting her offspring, a universally relatable goal that stands in stark contrast to the cold inhumanity of everything else. I also noticed that most enemies have a prominent mouth and teeth, with eyes either not present or minimized. The Mother is the opposite, featuring no visible mouth but having large eyes on all her wings. Not only important weak points for the player to regain health, but also symbolizing her not as hungry, but attentive, aware. She's also visually unique by being uncannily human-like in figure, down to even having nipples, which would imply she's a mammal. A lot of horror will contrast whatever disgusting or terrifying thing it intends to portray with beauty, often expressed through eroticism or natural life. It's a very simple tactic that I personally enjoy. The effect it has depends a lot on context and perspective. Perhaps the sheer difference will highlight the horror or amplify it through a representation of corrupted beauty. Maybe there is a thought-provoking statement in the idea that horror and beauty are not as distinct as we may like to believe. The imagery of childbirth comes to mind here. Whatever you might take from this, I think it's hard to deny that the presentation here is bold. Speaking from experience, I've seen shooting games that have a giant naked woman as the final boss, but this is the only one I can recall that actually renders the mammary papilla. To render actual nudity in such a horrifying context will probably turn away more people than it will draw in. I also believe that this one character probably features some of the most complicated animation work, in competition only with the player ship. Her attacks make use of various movements in her arms and wings, and there are multiple different animations for her curling up, sitting down, or laying back. These animations probably had to be made much more delicately than anything else because every other monster is not a human. As humans, we know how other humans move, so if something looks a bit shit, it'll be more noticeable than with whatever the hell this is meant to be. I think it's good that the final boss is so well made because she can easily take you longer to beat than every other level up to this point combined. In my case, it took a little over an hour and 40 minutes to get here on release day, and it took me around 2 hours to be done. I hope I'm not underselling how incredible the game's presentation is. You've been seeing the visuals and hearing the sound effects in the background throughout the video, so you should know, but it's even better than you might think. I had to consciously realize this game didn't have rumble because it doesn't have controller support at all. When you dealt enough damage to the boss and the screen started shaking with a low rumble, I just felt it in my bones. But I find the amazing aesthetic almost bittersweet in light of the fact that the final boss holds almost all the same complaints I had about the base gameplay. Her moveset is a good example of difficulty derived from variability, because each attack has multiple variations that require some difference in player response. The most obvious would be her directional swipe, where she either claws down vertically or reaches out horizontally. Relatively straightforward, it might only be difficult if your relative position or dexterity and reaction time betray you. Or if she crashes their wings into you and you get hit by a stray energy bullet, which honestly has no reason to be part of this attack. These directional energy beams are deceptively difficult, moving too fast to avoid if you're too far away, and giving little leeway up close. The first boss is a similar mechanism for stopping the player from simply getting out of range by instantly pulling them back in. Effectively ensuring the player gets hit is more punishing, but both techniques are a bit heavy-handed in light of the fact that you deal more damage per second if you're closer to the enemy. Although the attack goes multiple directions, most of them can be avoided through intermittently dodging to the side, and the horizontal one can be reacted to if you have your finger on the button to move up. I think it's a lot more natural for me at least to have my fingers on the left and right keys in case I wanted to make a correction, and thus any attack that does require upward or downward movement takes longer to react to if you're not expecting it. But there's no reason to switch horizontal directions during this attack, so you can prepare for the actual challenge of the matter. Her third attack is to spin around in a whirlwind, hurling blasts of energy vaguely in the player's direction while a bunch of rocks are flying around. Circling her in the same direction as the whirlwind is basically half the difficulty here. This attack feels largely random in that sometimes you could go through the attack a dozen times without thinking and never get hit once, but but sometimes a rock will come out of nowhere with little hope of the player being able to dodge it. After you've done around 12,000 damage, the mother will reel back and explode, transforming both herself and the arena. You can hide behind the little nubs in the ground to stay safe from the screen nuke, and immediately after transforming, she'll always do another screen nuke right away. Once you know what to do, this part of the fight becomes basically a formality where you take 3,000 points off her health, but the second explosion caught me off guard the first time. The screen nuke actually becomes another move in her rotation in the second phase, and I dislike that it has a similar animation to the whirlwind and a similar particle effect to the final new attack that she gets in her second phase, the big energy ball. This is one of the only attacks in the game that does force the player to be a bit proactive, because if you're not close enough to the ground to hide from the explosion, you will just die instantly. Just something to keep in mind whenever she's finished with one of her attacks. And finally, the big energy ball. This is just the dead man's volley, Zelda tennis time. But instead of hitting it, you dash into it. Positioning matters a little bit because you want to give yourself enough room to react with a dash when she's hitting it back to you, but it's mostly a challenge of rhythm and timing, just like everything else associated with a dash. Her attacks from the first phase also get stronger variations. She darkens the screen during her swipes to give you less information to react. Her directional energy beams are crazier, but can mostly be dealt with in the same exact way. The most interesting one is the whirlwind, where after stopping, all the rocks will vaguely move in the player's direction. There's also a universal change where destroying one of the eyes on her wings will cause it to shoot a laser beam at the player when it recovers, though it will refrain from shooting during certain attacks. Because the whirlwind has her cover her own body with her wings, the rhythm of the laser beams makes for an additional wrinkle to this move. Still a bit random, but it does manage to raise the skill floor. With the high health of this boss and the damage she can deal, the mother is the peak of this game's penchant for punishment. There are some knowledge checks and a bit of tight timing, but most of what's going to get you is just some unexpected wrinkle to her attack pattern. I understand why you can't just skip to her second phase, but it's a bit bothersome that even if you breeze through the first phase perfectly, it will still take about a minute. Feels like a lengthy formality to deal with if you just want to get back to the hard part. Once you get her below 6,000 health, she'll go to the center and destroy the tumors, releasing metabugs while she sits down, clearly gearing up for an explosion. I wasn't sure what to do the first time I got here, so I died and I decided I should ask someone on the official community Discord how to deal with her. The very next run I made it back and finally defeated her, but the solution here is kinda funny. I couldn't come up with a more perfect example clarifying the issues of the gameplay than the statement, "You defeat the final boss, final phase, one-hit kill explosion by dodging into it." Chiefly reactive challenges built upon positioning and timing, where most of the difficulty comes from the variability of damage sources and punishment for failure, but the one thing you're doing to interface with it all is dodging. Really is the whole game in a nutshell. There is an interactive ending sequence after this, and I did like it, but I don't have much to add, so I don't feel the need to show it off. I got the achievement for Prime in every mission only 3 days after the release date, and although I'd played and gotten acquainted with the demo beforehand, my total combined playtime was only about 24 hours. Although I complained about the game's approach to difficulty, I wanted to prove that, in the grand scheme of things, it's not actually all too difficult. There are some shooting games that took me around 24 hours to finish the final level, and this one I got the highest grade in every level with no more accolades to strive for. And so I'm not sure I'll be returning to this game out of sheer desire to replay it anytime soon. Despite how harsh I've been in my review, I think the premise and presentation of the game show that the developer is quite talented. I'm happy that Agelwik has gotten his name on the map for this, and I can only hope with the attention he has gotten that he can outdo himself with whatever he makes next.